Okay, welcome everyone to the next in our LEMDO webinar series. Today, I'm going to be talking about XML IDs on literary units. Before we begin, I would like to start with the territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Today we have a few learning objectives. The first is to know the importance of XML IDs. The next is to know the correct syntax for XML IDs for characters, acts, scenes, and speeches in your modernized texts. We're also going to talk a little bit about linking from speeches to characters using the who attribute, including encoding speeches with multiple speakers and with irregular speakers. So XML IDs, the most magical attribute, I was just saying this is really a foundational thing in the LEMDO environments is the XML ID. It's kind of what everything ends up being built on. So an XML ID is a TEI attribute. It's allowed on any element, and it's a unique identifier within the LEMDO project. An XML ID is only going to exist once within the entirety of LEMDO. It is the key to an item's URL. So, when your modernized text has a URL at the top of the web page, the XML ID is what makes that URL unique, and it's how that is formed. Which also means that if something has an XML ID, we can link to it. We use them in plenty of ways in the modernized text. The first is for the file itself. The file gets an XML ID, one of those unique identifiers, and it's formed like this. It goes on the TEI element at the very top of your modernized file. The TEI element will have an XML ID attribute, and your XML ID value will go into the quotations. They're formatted like this. It starts off with EMD, which stands for Early Modern Drama. Then we put the standard identifier either from MLA, or if there isn't anything in MLA for your particular text, from the DRE play abbreviations list, an underscore, and then an M for modern. Now, if you have multiple texts that you're modernizing, Henry V has a quarto text and a folio text, both are being modernized by the editor. You can add a little signifier to say this is the folio modernized text. So FM for folio, QM for for quarto modern, and other similar things like that. Characters also each get an XML ID. This is how your cast list is essentially kind of formulated. There's a list person element. That list person element has a type attribute with a value of cast list, and all of your characters will get a person element. The XML ID goes on the person element, and then extra information of like their name goes inside of that. And this is formulated fairly similar. We begin off with that file XML ID, EMD ado underscore M, then an underscore, and then a unique signifier. We typically would use just the name with a capital initial, so a capital L. The reason for that is sometimes you're going to have, things that might be repeated in other places. You might have a prologue as a division and also as a character. In that case, we need something to separate those two, and we use case to separate them. Our literary divisions, our acts, get XML IDs formulated like this. Each of your acts is going to be a div element. That div will have a type attribute, and if it's an act, it will have a value of act. It will have an N attribute that numbers which act it is. This one we'll say is act number 1, and then an XML ID. Hopefully the pattern kind of becomes similar or familiar quite quickly. We begin off with our file XML ID, emd ado_m. We have an underscore, and then we have A for act, and then the number. The number should match up with whatever the N value is on the div. So that was act 1. This is A1 on the XML ID. Scenes, same thing. We have a div element with a type attribute. Our value is now scene because this is a scene. We're saying this is scene 1. So it has N equals 1. And then we have an XML ID. There are kind of 2 ways that your play might appear. Your play might have acts and scenes, in which case you will have your file XML ID, an underscore, the signifier for the parent act. So if you're seen as a child of act 1, it would be A1. If you're seen as a child of act 2, it would be A2, and so on. Another underscore, S for scene, and then your scene number, which should also match your N value. Plays with only scenes, just get rid of the act. And there you go. Speeches are formulated like this. We have an SP element. It should have a who attribute. We'll talk about how that's created in a little bit. And then it will have the XML ID. Again, this is going to look a little bit different if you have acts or not. If you do have acts and scenes both, you will have your file XML ID, an underscore, your act signifier, another underscore, a scene signifier, another underscore, and then SP for speech and the speech number. Speech numbers start from 1 at the beginning of each scene. If your play only has scenes, again, you just take out that A for act signifier because you don't have them. And this is where I say, oh my goodness, isn't that repetitive? Yes, it is, and that's intentional. So with our XML IDs, because they're so key, we need to be kind of safe with how we use them. And the big important thing with that is each XML ID must be unique within the entirety of LEMDO. These are what we link to. If we have duplicates, it's going to confuse the whole system. And we've made it so that when there are duplicates, the website build breaks. Every time that we commit our changes to files, it kicks off a new build of our development site. And if it finds that there's more than one XML ID that's the same, it just won't be able to build. So we always need them to be unique. And patterns maintain uniqueness. Each XML ID is a snowflake. It is its own thing. No 2 are the same. So when we're looking at this, we know that each file XML ID is going to be unique because we're using a unique MLA or DRE abbreviation for that play. There's not 2 plays that have the abbreviation ado. That's just much ado about nothing. There's only 1 play with the abbreviation FV, Famous Victories of Henry V, and so on. So every file name or every file XML ID is going to be unique. When we begin subsequent ID, so every ID in that file begins with the XML ID of the file, it ensures that it can be unique within the entire LEMDO project because, you know, there's only 1 file with that XML ID, so all of its children will be unique. Within a file, you could, you know, theoretically accidentally put the same XML ID twice. Maybe you accidentally put Leonardo in twice in your character list. We have schematron that can check within a single file that XML IDs are unique. We can't check across the entire repo with schematron, but we can check within a single file. And so again, when we begin each XML ID with the file's XML ID, it allows us to make sure that it is for sure unique, even without needing to check every single file in the repo, because the construction of the ID ensures that for us. If you're feeling nervous and you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe I've accidentally duplicated an XML ID and I didn't mean to, you can check. We have an A to Z index to make sure that your XML ID is unique. And I will pull that up for you now. Here we are. You should now be seeing our LEMDO developer site. When you're in here, if you go to resources, right at the top, all XMLIDs.txt version, brings you to this big long list. This is every single XML ID within the LEMDO ecosystem. You'll notice these ones don't fit the formula that I was just showing you. That's because they are from our shared databases, which have different rules. But here we are, we're right in the EMD ado. So it's always beginning with that EMD, the play signifier underscore, signifier for the edition, and then so on. So you can always check back there, resources, all XML IDs, to make sure that your XML IDs are unique. Now, we do have a few standard identifiers that are how our signifiers should be formed for LEMDO. And these are them. Our acts should have A, scenes should have S, as we just said, speech is SP. Getting out of most modernized texts, but we do have this one as an extra one, is paragraph. So in your critical paratext, you will use the P element for paragraphs, and you will number those, and their signifier is P. Any text that is before the first scene, for example, a prologue, gets the signifier PR. Any non-scene text between scenes gets a BT, between. And then anything after the last scene, for example, an epilogue, gets a PS signifier. And for those ones, you would just add a number afterwards if you have more than one. They start from one and go up from there. Quick note, you do have control with those text before, between, and after scenes. You have control over the end values. So if you remember, we put n equals 1 for that first act or that first scene. You can put prologue as your end value for your prologues. We currently expect to see prologue, epilogue, chorus, and other as the end values. But if there's a strong request from an anthology saying, hey, we actually need whatever else it is that you need, we can potentially add more to that list of values. So what's the point? What's an XML ID's purpose? The big one is linking. Linking gives us targets and URLs. They come from our XML IDs. So we give an XML ID as the target of our linking elements. If you came to our linking webinar, you would have learned that, when we're linking from any file to our modern text, we're going to put a ref element or a pointer element, and it will have a target of doc and then the file XML ID, a hash character, and the XML ID of the thing that you're linking to. The XML ID is the key part to that. And they each become a URL on our website, which means that if a reader is going through, or a teacher is going through, and they want to send their students to speech 50 of your text, they can link directly to speech 50 and their students can go there directly, which makes life a lot easier for people. And it's also just nice for making our pages user-friendly. When we look at a modernized text, in the left-hand margin, we have these act, scene, and speech links that we get from our XML IDs. This is Act 1, Scene 1, Speech 1. And again, you can click on this and it gives you a unique URL and you can copy that URL from there. You can also directly go through the contents, which also we get because we have XML IDs. Each of these is a link. You click on it, it takes you directly to that act or scene. And so it really does make our work a lot more user-friendly. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about linking to characters using the who attribute. So who is our attribute? I feel like I'm in the who's on first skit right now. Who's on the attribute? Who is our attribute that allows us to link from a speech in the modernized text to a character in the character list? So when we're looking at a speech, this is what the entirety of our opening tag is going to look like. We begin off, of course, with our SP element itself. Then we have a who attribute. Who begins with a hash character. And again, if you're at that linking webinar, you might remember hash characters say, check within this place to find the following XML ID. That's what we're linking to. And when there's nothing in front of it, it's saying we're linking within a file. So this hash character says, hey, processor, I'm linking from this speech to something else within this file. And that thing is the speaker, the XML ID that we created in our list person on that person element. Of course, beginning with our file name or our file XML ID. It's the same as the file name, so I usually just say that a lot of the time. It's got our underscore, and then it has whatever the speaker ID is. After our who, we'll have an XML ID. Again, that'll be your file name, and then your scene or your act and scene number, and then your speech number. But oh no, what if there are two people sharing a speech? What do you do then? Well, first off, don't panic. It's not a big deal, just add a space. When we're working in our XML, if an attribute has two values, which if you have, two speakers, it has two values, we can just add a space and that says there's more than one value in here. So here we are. Both of them are formulated the same. They each begin with a hash character. Then they both have that file XML ID, and then they both have the signifier for their speakers. So this might be, Prince 1 and Prince 2. We probably don't have two princes. Servant 1 and Servant 2 speaking at the same time. And just adding a space in between lets you do that. But Navarra, you say, I've got a problem. Everybody is talking. What do I do? Again, don't worry too much. We have something to deal with that. And it is speaker other. So this is the one time that you're not going to be linking directly to a person in your character list. Instead, we're going to be using this value that we've created. So SPKR:other, that says, you know what, we're not linking to a character. And it also, in our modernized texts, the who is really important because our schematron will check that whoever your speaker is matches up with your character list. I think Janelle talked about this at the last webinar, but your speaker of your speech must match exactly with a character in your character list, and it figures out which character it's meant to match with using XML ID. So if you don't have the correct XML ID or if you don't have the correct speaker, you're going to get an error. And of course, you're not going to have a character called all or voices within. And so this is our way of saying, yeah, don't worry about it, schematron. This is intentional. We're not linking to a specific character. Okay, so a quick recap of all of these before I hand it over to Janelle. We've talked about XML IDs today. We said they must always be unique. They must always start with the file XML ID for your modernized text, and they follow standard patterns. Acts are A, scenes are S, speeches are SP, paragraphs are P, things before your scenes are PR, between your scenes are BT, and after your scenes are PS. And these XML IDs are used to create links, to add linkable act, scene, and speech numbers to the side of your text, and to create a linkable table of contents. We also talked about the who attribute, which links from speech elements to your character list. They usually begin with a hash character, with the exception of when you have irregular speakers, which we use speaker : other for. When you have multiple speakers, you can just separate them with a space and everything will be fine. Now, we do have quite a few resources about all of this. The first is create a unique XML ID, a unique value for an XML ID attribute. That talks about how do you go about making sure that your XML ID is unique. That's the one that's not inside of the modernized text chapter, but it is a key thing for general encoding. Also encode speakers in modern text, literary divisions in modern text, number acts and scenes, number speeches, and number prologues, epilogues, and intro texts. Now I will pass it on to Janelle, so I won't give the acknowledgements now. Maybe she will at the end, but that is my section. So I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it on over.
Thank you, Navarra. I will indeed give the acknowledgements at the end. All right, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk about how to encode songs and letters and stage directions. So we'll start with letters and songs, and then we'll move on to stage directions. If you have questions, please feel free to ask as we go. So you will be reminded first how prose and verse speeches are encoded using the P and L elements, because we need to understand how that works in order to encode songs and letters. And then you will know how to encode a song or verse letter using the LG element. LG stands for line group. The learning outcomes for the stage directions half of my section here are as follows. You will know DRE's editorial policy on amending or moving original stage directions, by which I mean the stage directions that show up in our early texts, the quartos, folios, occasional octavos, and duodecimos. You'll know DRE's editorial policy on adding editorial stage directions. You will know when to collate a stage direction. You will know how to encode stage directions, and you will know how to classify them as one or more types. Okay, on to letters and songs. But first, we're just going to refresh necessary prior knowledge. So if you are encoding a prose speech in your modern text, you will wrap the entire prose speech in a P element. P actually stands for paragraph in TEI XML markup language. We use it in a slightly off-label way to indicate prose. And you can see that the entire speech, SP, has its child speaker element, and then the child P containing the content of the speech. Words, 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 as Hamlet says. So I've taken away the XML IDs, the who attributes here, but they would, of course, be present in a full modern text. Verse speeches work exactly the same way, except that every single line of verse gets wrapped in the L tags. L is for line in TEI XML. All right, so we'll see some examples in upcoming slides of examples where there are multiple lines. Okay, if you've worked in TEI before, you may be aware that there is an LG element for line group. We don't use the LG element inside verse speeches unless the verse lines together form some kind of poetic unit, like a stanza or a sonnet. If that is the case, as is the case in this play, early Tudor play Nature, you can wrap the stanzas in the LG element. And what you do is you have a parent LG element, and all of these L elements wrapping around each line are children of LG. This particular speech has 2 stanzas. Actually, it has more. We've just compressed for teaching purposes. And so we can have multiple LG elements inside our speech. Each of them has a type attribute with a value stanza. And we can just keep going until this character, Nature, has delivered all of the stanzas that they are going to deliver. Okay, so that's a refresher of how we're using P and L and LG. So now we can talk about how songs work. So the basic model for a song is that we take that LG element for line group, we add the type attribute with the value song, and then we have our child L elements wrapping around each line of the song. This is from London's Tempe, where the Cyclops sing their song while hammering thwack, 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 thwack. So it looks exactly like the encoding for a stanza. We just use this different type attribute, song. Sometimes songs are delivered inside a speech. In that case, we would have the P element wrapped around the prose section of the speech. If it happened to be verse, we would use the L element, wrapping each verse line in the L element. And then we can have the song here. So all of this is a single speech by Pistol in Henry V. He introduces his song with "The plain song is most just, for humors do abound, knocks come and go, God's vassals drop and die." Closing tag for our P element. Then we have a stage direction, and we're going to talk about stage directions in the second half, so I won't say anything about that now. We have our line group, type equals song, and here is 3 lines of a song that Pistol sings. Here is a fairly complicated example from Merchant of Venice, where we have different speakers collectively singing a song. So we'll just parse out the basics of it. We've got 2 speeches here for whoever is singing "Tell Me Where Is Fancy Bread." And then we have another speech element, SP, for the refrain, "Ding Dong Bell." Okay. So we would have a who attribute on SP, of course, and this is a great example of where you would use that speaker other value. But we want to indicate that even though this song is spread across 2 speeches, it's still all one song. So this is the solution that we came up with. So we've got our song split across the 2 speeches. We have an LG element type equals song for this first part of the song, and we repeat that again in the second speech, LG type equals song. Okay, so essentially they're encoded as separate songs, but we're going to glue them back together using XML IDs. And so what we do is we give the 2 parts of the song an XML ID. And following the principles that Navarra talked about, we create an XML ID that is based on the XML ID of the file. So this is EMD MV underscore M underscore, and I'm going to call this song 1. As long as it's unique in my file, You can call it whatever you want, but it does help to give it a name that is parsable. Somebody can look at that and go, oh, this is an XML ID for a song. I'm going to call the second half of the song, song 2, constructing my XML ID exactly as Navarra taught us. And now I'm going to use 2 attributes that you haven't seen before to glue the 2 pieces of the song back together. So we have a next attribute on the first half of the song. And next is pointing to the XML ID that we gave to the second half of the song. Okay, and there's that hashtag telling us, as Navarra explained, to go, or for a processor to go and look somewhere in this file. No need to look elsewhere. The XML ID you want is right here. So hashtag emdmv underscore m underscore song 2. And that points to this XML ID that we've defined right here. On the second half of the song, we use a prev attribute, which is short for previous. And here, the value of our prev attribute points us back to the first half of the song. Hashtag emdmv underscore m underscore song 1, pointing there. Okay, so that is parsable by our processor. If we ever decided to harvest all of the songs from our corpus, it would harvest this entire song as one song, even though it's spread across 2 speeches. We haven't written that processing yet, but with encoding, you anticipate that you might want to do things down the road, and you can't harvest things unless you have planned ahead and encoded things correctly. So while I'm on this slide, I want to point out something else. So we have an LG element for the song, but we also have child LG elements inside that song because songs often have stanzas of their own. So if that's the case, you can nest an LG element inside an LG element. You can in fact do that almost infinitely, although you wouldn't have a use case for more than 2 LGs. Okay, so we can have our LG type equals stanza exactly as we encoded verse speeches, where the verse forms formal stanzas. Then we have our child L elements for each line of the poem. We close the LG element for the stanza. We open a new LG for the second stanza, type equals stanza. We close it right here. And then we have the closing LG tag for this whole song. Okay, so we're combining what we've already learned from encoding poetry with what we've just learned about encoding songs. All right, letters. I'm not entirely happy with yet with how we're encoding letters. It's something that we need to continue working on. Verse letters are very easy. So we're going to use that LG element again with the type attribute and introduce a different value here for verse letter. This one we inherited from the Internet Shakespeare editions, and it makes good sense. So we're going to keep using it. And then we have our child lines. Okay, so this is actually a verse letter in the form of a sonnet. It's Helena's letter to back home when she's chasing Bertram across Europe. I've just given you the first 4 lines here. If you wanted to break down the sonnet into quatrains and couplets, you could do that. Okay, if there are no questions, I'm going to move on to stage directions. The basic encoding practice for a stage direction is to use the stage element. Nice and simple. Enter the whole army. So we simply wrap the stage direction that we want to show up in our modern text in the stage element. We're not finished though when we've added the closing and opening and closing stage tags. So again, we use that type attribute. Type is probably the most common attribute in our project after XML IDs, I would guess. Stage, type, and then we have a taxonomy of values that you're allowed to use on the type attribute at this point. So this is an entrance, stage type equals entrance, enter the whole army. These are the allowed values of the type attribute on the stage element, and I've grouped them together on the screen deliberately. So entrance and exit and remain are all values that govern who's on stage. Entrance and exit are standard TEI values recommended by the TEI. We've added the value remain because we so frequently have stage directions that say that somebody remains on stage, usually manette or manent. Then we have setting and location, which have something to say about the geography of the stage or the imagined geography of the stage. And those are really tricky, so I'm going to come back to them. Business and dumb show describe some kind of action that accompanies text in the case of business or happens without text. We debated for a long time about the terminology dumb show. We wanted to avoid what might be construed as ableist language. However, we eventually landed back on dumb show because that is the term that's used in criticism. And also it's the term that's used in early modern plays. And frankly, no other clear alternative presented itself. And then the final group of stage direction types have to do with noises or the way something's delivered, sound and delivery. And I'm going to come back to delivery as well because it's a bit tricky. Okay, so assuming that entrance, exit, and remain are self-explanatory, I'll move on to setting. So setting and location are easily confused by our editors, we find. When you are selecting the values for the type attribute, if you're working in Oxygen, you will get a drop-down menu giving you the options that you're allowed to pick at this point. And that drop-down menu will come with a definition. So if you forget, let Oxygen guide you as you make your choice. So here is our TEI, our LEMDO customization of TEI definition of setting for our project. Describes a setting, e.g. in her bed, a council chamber, any direction that gives a description of temporal or spatial setting. And then I've highlighted in red, do not use this value to describe a stage location. So the idea here is that if there's a stage direction that invites us to imagine where action is taking place, we will use the setting value. So enter as from writing. That is inviting us to imagine a certain geography, imaginative geography. Servants with torches could also be construed as setting because if people come in with torches, it's saying something about what time of day we're supposed to imagine that it is. Enter Barabbas to his counting house from the Jew of Malta, or enter Barabbas to his counting house. So we have to imagine that this is a counting house. Location, on the other hand, describes a location on stage. So this is not imagined geography, but the actual spatial disposition of the material building that is the stage. So describes a location on stage such as above or at one door. Okay, and then highlighted in red for the purposes of the slide, do not use this value to describe a setting. Do not assign a location that is not required by an early modern stage direction or implied by a dialogic stage direction. So we don't want editors to start directing the play and deciding that certain actions have to happen in certain places on the stage. But if that information is present in an early stage direction from a folio, quarto, octavo, or duodecimo text, you want to provide that information to the reader. And we also want to be able to harvest those stage directions later. So location is the value for that. So examples that you're likely to see within, that is somewhere within the disposition of the theater and the stage, above, severally, indicating that they're coming in from different locations. Okay, business is for, it's a bit of a catch-all category, but it describes stage business and character actions like kneeling. Delivery describes how or to whom a character speaks, normally on stage, but it's also allowed for offstage stage directions. So if you have they cry within, that is like crying is a way of delivering something. Okay, we could also say that that is a location. So things like clarification of who is being addressed. Sometimes editors mark that. Addressee change, asides, or specialized dialogue. So sings, reading, weeping, those would all be delivery. Many stage directions are doing more than one thing. And in this case, we can combine values on the type attribute. If you know TEI already, you may know that normally we do not combine values on a type attribute. So the nature of the type attribute is that it can take only one value, except on the stage element. The stage element is the only element that can take multiple values for stage. So we can take the values that are in that taxonomy of values and we can put them together like this. So if the stage direction is here, they rob them and bind them, exeunt, it might be tempting to split that up into two stage directions, but don't do that. That messes up with it. That messes our processing up considerably. And you also want to keep in mind that for a compositor of an early text, that would constitute one unit of text. So instead, we capture all of it in a single stage direction element, and we add the values business, because something has to happen as the actors rob the victims and bind them. And then we have an exeunt. This is from Henry IV, part 1, the robbery scene. Okay, so business and exit, and you put a little space between the two values, but both values are inside the quotation marks that demarcate the values of our attributes. And there's no limit to the number that you can have. So in this case, knocking within, exeunt, hostess, Francis, and Bardolph, enter Bardolph running. We have a sound, knocking. We have an exit for the hostess, Francis, and Bardolph. And then we have an entrance for Bardolph as well. I suppose we could add a location value as well, because we have knocking within. Okay, so now some editorial guidelines. LEMDO tends to be quite minimalist in the stage directions that it supplies in the modern text. And so the minimum that you have to do is get your characters on and off the stage. There is a downstream processing reason for that. We do want to be able to generate doubling charts. And if you don't do the work in stage directions of getting characters off stage, we might not be able to do that. It's worth noting that early texts are far more likely to omit exits than entrances. The thinking there is that the bookkeeper needs to get actors onto stage, and actors need to know when they need to be out there, but they're perfectly capable of finding their way off. So say the critics, and that seems to be matched by the patterns in the early printed texts. General rule is that you retain the original stage directions unless there's a really compelling reason to remove them. You are allowed to amend stage directions in certain ways. So because of the need to get your characters on and off stage, you can add entrances and exits where they are necessary. And in that case, you would collate them. So if you've added an exit for a character and there wasn't an exit marked in the early text, then you would collate to indicate that that exit was not in the early text. If an editor before you chose to place that exit there, then you would also in your collation give credit to the editor who put an exit for that character at that point. You can move stage directions if necessary. So if a stage direction is a little bit too early, or if it seems to be unnecessarily late, you can move it to the right place. In that case, it's really difficult to collate. So you add a textual note in your annotation file saying where the stage direction appeared in your copy text, and then where you've moved it to and on what grounds you have moved it. So if a character is still speaking, they can't have just exited, for example. You are also entitled, encouraged to add clarifications if necessary, right? So if, if the stage direction says ladies, you might want to spell out for the modern reader who those ladies are, unless they happen to be unnamed generic lady characters. Again, you would collate. So important point here, it has been editorial practice for over 100 years to put editorial stage directions in square brackets. When DRE was putting together its editorial guidelines, we asked ourselves if those square brackets were really performing a useful function and if there was another way we could handle things. The consensus among the senior editors that we consulted is that the square brackets and stage directions were really just there to save space on the page so that they didn't have to be included in the collation. So we've chosen to drop the square brackets in modern stage directions and instead move the work of explaining the differences between your modern text and the copy text you're working from in the collation, right? And the ideological grounds for that, if you like, are that the modern text is essentially a mass emendation of a copy text. And so you collate emendations in the same way that you would collate emendations anywhere in the text. All right. It also stops people from adding unnecessary information. Square brackets became a kind of excuse to start directing the play, and we do not want editors to do that. Okay, so things not to do. Do not start directing the play. Trust that theater practitioners will figure out how to perform the play. The oft repeated line is that editors put everything in and directors take everything out. So we need to ask ourselves if it's really necessary to add those kinds of things. Do not describe a production you've seen. I think that habit from the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s is probably mostly gone, but especially with plays that don't have much of a performance history, if you have been fortunate enough to see a single production, keep in mind that you don't want your stage directions to be influenced by that particular production. LEMDO really encourages people to do productions, performance exercises while they're editing, but any information that you derive from that needs to go into your annotations. And do not specify setting unless the original stage direction does so. And so it was the case that additions were indicating on an in a note on a scene where the action was taking place. On that bare, unlocalized stage on which so many early modern plays were performed, except for masks, it really didn't matter in a lot of cases where the action was taking place. And so by saying that something is taking place in a specific setting, we're often working against the actual technology of the early modern stage. If you feel like it's not going to be clear to the reader, you can use your annotations. Okay, so this is from a fragment of a play by Rachel Fain, edited by Lucy Monroe. And the editor thought that it would be valuable for readers to know where the action was probably taking place. And so, but instead of saying, location, interior rooms, that work is happening in an annotation. The annotation marker's right there on scene 1. I've clicked on it, and this is what pops up on the screen. The first 3 scenes are set in interior rooms. Okay. So unless there's a really compelling reason to say where the imagined setting is, no need to annotate it at all. If you think people might be confused, then do go ahead and annotate it, but don't make it part of your stage direction. Okay, and here's just a quick example of collating stage directions. This is Henry V, Act 1, Scene 2. The original stage direction from the folio text is enter the King, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, Bedford, Clarence, Warwick, Westmoreland, and Exeter, with the language modernized. And our editor has added with attendance. So if we click on the collation marker right here, what pops up in the LEMDO environment is this. So with attendance is omitted from F. Malone suggested adding a comma with attendance, and our editor has chosen to follow Malone in that regard. Okay, so previous editions would have put that in square brackets. We do not do that. We collate. To recap, you have learned that prose is encoded with a P element, that verse lines are wrapped in L elements, and that we use LG only if the verse lines are formal structures like stanzas or sonnets. You have learned to wrap stage directions in the stage element, to add a type attribute to the stage element. You have learned that you may assign multiple values to a stage direction. You have learned that you should collate stage directions that you add, augment, or clarify. And you have learned that you should add an annotation if you change the placement of an original stage direction. Okay, so we have resources on how to encode letters and songs, and good documentation on how to encode stage directions in the modern text. I'll just flag that our next webinar is on annotations on December 5th, and you can register at the URL on the slide. Slides have been pre-circulated. So thank you to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding this webinar series, to Navarra Houldin for the lovely slide design, Martin Holmes, as always, for our TEI customization, and the Humanities Computing and Media Center for site design and hosting.